Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whitlaw. Now, before I introduce my guest this week, just wanted to remind you, you might have seen we put a video up quite recently about the New Culture Forum Smith Lecture, which is happening this year in London on November the 29th. The guest speaker is the wonderful Rod Liddle, so it will be very amusing as well as very enlightening. Do rush and get tickets because they are selling fast. We will put the link to where you go under this video if you want to look at that, and you'll see if you just go on that and then you'll be able to get tickets. That's the 29th of November. It's a Tuesday here in London. Smith Lecture with Rod Liddle. My guest this week is one of the chief proponents of what is called National Conservatism. Yoram Hazony is the author of a critically praised book which came out a while ago called The Virtue of Nationalism. He is chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation and also president of the Herzl Institute. He's with me now. His new book is called Conservatism, a Rediscovery. Thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, we actually were meant to do this in the summer.
Right.
Actually, no, not in the summer. First in the summer, and then in September. And then, of course, what happened is the Queen died, and it was going to be very, very difficult to arrange everything. Before I talk about the book, I'd be very interested to know, looking from the outside, you're based in Israel, aren't you? Looking from the outside, what conclusions did you draw? What impressions did you get during that period of Britain in terms of conservatism? I mean, here we had the death of a much beloved queen and the accession of a king, and the public reaction to it. What was your impression? Did it look like we were in good health?
Look, in some ways, the UK is one of the healthiest and most traditional of societies. There's still a queen, now a king. There's the common law is there somewhere. The House of Lords is still around. The Church of England. So in terms of structures, it looks like an extremely conservative traditional society, and yet at the same time we know that the UK is going through the same cultural revolution that is sweeping America and other countries. And we sit at this moment of dramatic crisis where Marxist woke neo-Marxism has taken hold of vast numbers of institutions, both public and private.
Yeah.
It is not clear that the old liberalism has enough strength in it to be able to, in any way, to retake these positions of power. And so, we're left with the question of what could come next if we don't want to live in a perpetual neo-Marxist cultural revolution. What could be next?
Yes, I mean, I think the point really is that one of the reasons for my question was that if you looked at that particular time, all the instruments of the state all seem to be, in good working order in place. But of course, those are just, if you like, the buildings. The buildings have been entirely hollowed out. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, it is a little bit more than the buildings, because having the ability, it's not merely the gorgeous, stunning, extremely noble and honorable traditions about how to part with a beloved monarch and bring in a new one. It's more than that. The public in Britain wakes up and finds itself wanting to participate in these traditions. There's a solemnity and a nobility in which the public wants to take part. It's not, you don't have all sorts of people running around in the UK, holding protests saying, down with the monarchy. We need a liberal republic right now.
Mm.
So that's meaningful it is significant, but it stands in stark contradiction, in sharp tension with the cultural revolution that's swirling around. These two forces are not, they can't coexist indefinitely.
You say cultural revolution there. I mean, I would want to talk a little bit about what National Conservatism is. But first of all, there was a chapter in your book which frankly spoke hugely to me. And it's called The Challenge of Marxism, chapter 7. And in it, you are quite clear that this is a Marxist thing happening, but that it's an updated Marxism. Now, that might be quite obvious to you, but I think there's an awful lot of intellectual energy that's being expended at the moment on what is the actual nature of this. You are quite clear. You're saying we have reaching a peak, if you like, reaching a victory, if you like, in 2020. This has been updated Marxism.
Yes, look, intellectuals are capable of having fine-grained arguments about virtually any subject. In this book, I try to keep it simple and clear, rather than going into all of these historical side arguments. The simple fact is that Marx and Engels and articulated a very, very particular vision of why there should be revolution. Why this, not only the government structures, but the societies in which they live need to be undermined and overturned. And that structure is based on a few premises. First, the power of the Marxist paradigm the Marxist framework comes from the fact that Marx correctly understands something that many liberal thinkers who he's criticizing did not understand, which is that human societies are not composed of individuals. They're composed of individuals who invariably form classes or groups. You can call them, I think loyalty groups is a broader term, but he calls them classes, which is to say that human beings do not, as individuals, come together and decide to have a government and remain individuals. Nothing like that happens. We are born into families and congregations and tribes and nations. Sometimes in adulthood we may switch to a different nation or a different congregation, but wherever we end up, the structure is always the same. Human beings live in these hierarchically ordered groupings to which they're loyal, and when something happens to my group, then I feel it almost as though it's happening to myself. So that's the first thing. Marx understands that society is made out of loyalty groups or classes. The second is that, and this is where it begins to become controversial, is that Marx argues that these, not only do these classes or groups inevitably compete with one another, which is, I think, generally true, but that whichever group comes out the strongest, they will inevitably oppress and exploit the weaker groups around them. In addition to the direct exploitation, there's an indirect exploitation, which ends up later being called false consciousness, which is the idea that the dominant group not only does it use its superior force to exploit other groups, but it also generates a kind of a ruling ideology, which is then taught to all the groups, so that every group in society ends up believing the things that the dominant group, the things that serve the dominant group's interest. So it's much more insidious than simple exploitation. It's exploitation accompanied by this kind of brainwashing. So people don't even know that they're being exploited. And the ruling class doesn't necessarily know that they're doing the exploiting, because they too are brainwashed. And then Marx proposes that the only way out is the overthrow of the ruling class, the ruling group. Now, it's a famous question. What happened? For people reading Marx, both scholars and laymen, what's supposed to happen after the revolution? Because he just told us clearly that that after that ruling groups compete, and then one takes over, and then it exploits the others, and that's inevitable. And then he says, well, yes, but when when the masses, the largest group, when they finally have a revolution, they will not exploit anyone, and all of this will disappear. So suddenly it turns utopian and, frankly, very difficult to believe. So when we look at the history of Marxism, there's a phenomenon called neo-Marxism. Neo-Marxism is a fancy name for scholars and theorists who took these ideas and said, look, they don't just apply to economics, they apply also to culture. And the theory of the cultural revolution, where there's a dominant group, in our day, people say, the white male patriarchy or something like that, and all the other groups are exploited. There's no possibility of a mutually beneficial society in which the stronger groups and the weaker groups all benefit. Instead, there has to be exploitation. The dominant group has to be seen as evil, and the overthrow of that group is the only legitimate goal. It's the only legitimate politics. That is the heart of the woke movement. I think it's quite clear that they've named the dominant group. They've argued that the other groups are ceaselessly exploited and oppressed by the dominant group, by white males, and they've declared that the only legitimate politics is the overthrow of that group, and they work tirelessly towards that.
Would that then, it would sort of suggest to me maybe that you would tend to believe that there was a kind of Gramscian entry into all of the various institutions of the state, which has sort of come to fruition.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Gramsci, one of the early neo-Marxists, analyzed society in the early 20th century and said, look, we can see after World War I, we can see that that the working class is not going to rise up and overthrow the economic order. If we want to see a revolution, we're going to have to work on the elites, on the institutions that govern the society at all levels. And he said that's where the power is. The overthrow is not going to come from the workers down below. It's going to come from educated elites, the bureaucracy, the managers, the people who run everything. When they have embraced a revolutionary Marxist consciousness, then we'll see the revolution.
Yes.
And it's 100 years later, and his predictions have proved prescient.
Yes, entirely right, it seems to me. One thing that I think is some of the passages in this book are so beautiful, and you talk about the way in which, and I'm really praising it here, the way in which liberalism, or liberals, for want of a better expression, tend to be, as it were, the kind of midwives of what we have now. They inevitably take on Marxism, even though they start from a position of basically not being Marxist necessarily. But what interests me, so I can understand that, but what interests me is you also go into the various different developments from the 1960s onwards, basically, whereby what we would call conservatism sort of lost its way. This is a whole survey of what happened here. But could you briefly tell us what you talk about Cold War conservatism, and it seems to the end result seems to be that it became just solely about something called liberty, and not really about those things that one once would have defined conservatives, such as family, such as nation, such as a locale.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I think so. Yes. I mean, one of the main arguments of the book is that there is an important distinction to be drawn between liberalism and conservatism, and to present that distinction simply. If you are the kind of person who believes that what you need to understand about politics, about the political world and society, is fundamentally the freedom and equality of all individuals, that individuals do not take moral and political obligations upon themselves except through consent, except through their agreeing to take obligations, and consequently that the role of government should be limited only to the defense of these individual liberties and equalities that belong to all men and women by nature. If that's your view, then you're a liberal. There are different kinds of liberals. There are progressive liberals and classical liberals and libertarians, but they all share that framework. Conservatives do not begin in that place. Conservatives begin with an understanding that all of us are born into families and tribes and nations. That means that we're born into a certain inheritance. We probably grow up with a certain attitude with respect to God and Scripture. That might be positive or negative, but there's some kind of an attitude that we inherit from our family and the community around us towards God and Scripture, towards nation, family, congregation, man and woman, and what's the proper relationship between men and women, honor, sanctity, loyalty. All of these things are prominent features of a traditional society, of a conservative society that is concerned to advance itself, my nation, my religion, my inheritance, and to propagate it over many generations. Now, conservatives can and do take an interest in individual liberties, but as part of a much deeper and broader inheritance that gives you an entire matrix that gives the individual direction. Today, people say guardrails, a common sense about how far can you go with these inherited principles before you start to break them, before you start to destroy the society instead of fixing it and improving it. So a conservative is not a liberal. There are all sorts of people who are today confused. You brought up the Cold War, the Cold War alliance, Cold War conservatism, which was it was an alliance between liberals and conservatives after the Second World War. Its great architect was William Buckley. It included other famous conservative thinkers like Russell Kirk. And this alliance, it took the name eventually of fusionism. What was being fused was liberalism and conservatism. Two very different things were brought together, and for a good cause. The reason for it was that Buckley and his circle saw, this was the 1950s, saw the spread of communism. China had just fallen to the communists. There was a rising tide of both actual communist activism and more broadly a socialist worldview in the UK and America and throughout the West. And they said, look, we have to defeat these twin menaces of communism abroad and socialism at home. Let's fuse liberalism and conservatism together. The anti-Marxist liberals, those liberals who are willing to fight Marxism, and the conservatives will be one thing. Now, the idea of an alliance makes sense. They were few in numbers for various reasons, and an alliance makes sense, but the fusion doesn't make sense. The fusion was an attempt to say, look, really, there isn't much difference between liberalism and conservatism. The way that they pulled this off was to declare that the public sphere would be liberal, but in our private lives, we should be conservatives. So there's a privatization of all inheritance and tradition, and it becomes the responsibility of the family and the church to hand down, all values and all virtues and anything that the next generation needs to inherit from the past. Whereas the public sphere is kind of neutral; it just allows all things to flourish. So this was very successful in an important sense. This kind of fusionism was prominent in bringing Ronald Reagan to power in America, Margaret Thatcher in the UK. It was front and center, gave much of the energy and some of the ideas that were relevant for bringing down the Soviet Union. By 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and fusionism had emerged victorious. The troubling thing about this seeming success story is I was a Reagan activist. My wife and I founded a Reagan Thatcherite publication called the Princeton Tory when we were in college at Princeton. And what was shocking to us is that we understood conservatism to have multiple principles and planks. Irving Kristol was probably our most important teacher, and he taught us that conservatism is about religion, with three things he said: religion, nationalism, and economic growth. And of those, he said that religion is the most important.
Yes.
The argument was that freedom by itself, left completely unchecked, will end up acting as a solvent. It'll destroy everything. So you have to have the religious and national traditions in order to balance it and harness the freedom towards doing good instead of just destroying society. But by the time that Prime Minister Thatcher steps down in 1990, we all know that what came out of that was certainly not nationalism and certainly not religion, but 25 years of all freedom all the time. The liberty of the individual, which liberals think that's the heart of everything. Conservatives know that liberty is important, yes, but needs to be balanced. So by the time that George H.W. Bush is declaring a new world order in which the entire world would be wrapped in the rule of the rule of law in order to advance liberalism. I mean, this is what became known as liberal internationalism, or the rules-based liberal order.
What I take from what you're saying, therefore, is that conservatism, or fused conservatism, what came out of that was just way too weak to form any kind of defense to the onslaught that we're now seeing.
Yes.
And that's where National Conservatism comes in. I mean, your book is called Conservatism, a Rediscovery. I mean, one of the main questions that our audience asks really on is, look, we entirely agree with what you say, all of this. What do we do about it? What can we do about it? Because we appear to be in a system now in this country, I think in an odd way less in America, but there is very little to choose between the two parties, or nothing actually, not really, if you're talking party political terms. So how can conservatism, true conservatism, how can it in any way come back? How can it be a way to fight this? I mean, this is what you're really setting out here, isn't it? Yes.
Well, so let me focus just for a second on why liberalism is so weak. Okay, because it's not obvious. The advocates of liberalism in the 1950s and 60s did not believe it was going to collapse into some kind of Marxism. They saw it as the weapon against Marxism, and it turns out that they were mistaken on this point. The reason is that in the name of liberalism, they declared the state and the public sphere to be neutral among all things. Now, some of this is good. If you're declaring neutrality between people who have light skin color and people have dark skin color, then I support that. I know very few people who don't think that that's a requirement of justice. But if the state is going to be insisting that there is an equality, an equality on all issues, so then you start to say, okay, so equality between men and women. Well, maybe that can be done. How about equality between Christians and Jews and atheists? All right, now, I'm a Jew. I'm not the majority in. My co-religionists are not the majority in the UK or in America. But does that mean that the state needs to be neutral? Does that mean that that God and Bible and prayer need to be eliminated from the schools so that we can have this neutral state? Well, this keeps going. It turns out that you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of age. You're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of disability. You're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. The problem with this is, I think as soon as you start listening, what you realize is that each one of these steps tears up and overthrows the traditional norms that have been handed down. So in some cases that might be desirable, but the principle that every group needs to be equal to every other group, that the state has to, the state and society have to be without norms, without any kind of guiding norms to allow anything to be considered to be better than something else. In the end, you get to you're not allowed to discriminate between the citizens of your country and people who are born in another country. That means that borders become illegitimate. Every distinction becomes illegitimate. And in that context, when children are raised, parents say to their children, you should reason for yourself, think for yourself, do whatever makes you happy. I'll support you whatever you choose in life. On the face of it, that's a generous and positive thing. But in a society in which there are no guardrails, in which all the norms have been thrown out, nothing is considered to be better or worse in the school system or in society. In that context, what we've discovered is that children being told, think for yourself, they're just as likely to come up being woke neo-Marxists as they are liberals. Some of them also come out fascists. I mean, the total freedom to be anything you want. Well, the liberals thought that it would make everyone liberals, but it doesn't. It doesn't do anything like that at all. The actual outcome is young people feel like they're drowning in an ocean of choices, don't know how to make the choices, and when they do make the choices, sometimes they're incredibly vicious.
What then, this follows on from that really, what you're saying. What then would National Conservatism offer those young people?
Yeah.
Now, we should say, we were talking about this just before we started recording, which you made the point that the book here is part of a sort of wider project in the sense that there are conferences going on. There was one in Florida recently, was there not?
Yes.
And in Europe. And in fact, a lot of young people are actually coming to these.
Yeah.
What is it that they are getting then?
Let me just say that the book is my own personal, it's my own personal views.
Yes.
But it is a part of a broader movement. This is National Conservatism is the you could say it's the reaction to liberal internationalism. It's almost in a sense a mirror image that if 25 or 30 years liberals were selling us, we have to take down the borders, we have to create one unified liberal order that's going to cover the entire globe. everyone's going to join. Whoever doesn't join is going to be forced to join. In 2016, both with Brexit and the Trump movement, and subsequently with Orban and Meloni now, and in other countries, we've seen what's common to these different nationalist conservative movements. What's common to them is that that there's a broad public that's saying, look, you can't simply take my inheritance, my national traditions, my religious traditions, put them under some kind of universal rule of bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats. So that could be the World Economic Forum, it could be the European Union, it could be the World Trade Organization. But what all of these things have in common is that these are unelected experts who are taking upon themselves to govern the world using liberal principles and through the elites, as we discussed earlier. And many people, it turns out, can't accept this. They can't accept the idea that that Parliament, which has been governing England, for many centuries, in an increasingly democratic fashion, is simply going to be superseded by experts sitting in committees and world bodies. They'll pick up the phone to the ministers in the UK, or they'll call the EU, and the EU will call the ministers in the UK, and they'll say, look, you can't do it this way. It doesn't matter that England has been doing it this way for centuries. You must do it some other way.
Yeah.
So in practice, this cashes out in terms of all sorts of issues: economic, cultural, social, and religious. The most obvious one is the insistence that national borders have to be eliminated. But there are also issues of, if the World Economic Forum, if they decide that the right thing to do is to have a fluid flotation of manufacturing, of economic capacities from one country to another, that's the best for the world, and that means that your economy is going to be stripped of its assets and sent somewhere else where the same factories can be run more cheaply. If that's the decision, then you simply have to smile and take it. But people don't.
Yeah.
And national conservatism is the response to that.
It's almost. I think you say something similar to this, but it is almost like saying, actually, if we have tried this new thing, or we have gone along this road and it's awful and it's not working, we should actually go back and reestablish what our forefathers had.
Yes,
that's it. Really.
Well, so that is at the heart of Anglo-American conservatism. Yeah. Is it's funny. So you often hear people say that the job of the conservative is to conserve whatever exists, and I don't. It's very difficult to find that in the writings of actual conservative thinkers. I mean, there's wonderful English conservative tradition, which you can trace it all the way back. But in the book, I begin with John Fortescue in the 1400s, and so there's this wonderful tradition. Fortescue, Selden, Hooker, Clarendon, and Hale, and Blackstone, all of these centuries before Burke, and one thing that they all understand is that human things, human institutions, that they always decay. All human things, no matter how good they are, they run down. They become corrupted. The original people who established a certain order are gone, and within a few generations, it starts to malfunction. The role of the conservative is not to freeze the current condition, but rather to understand in what ways have our positive institutions in what ways have they decayed? What do we need to restore in order to return us to functionality? Now, that doesn't mean that every single thing that was was the case 50 years ago, a conservative will say, no, we'll try simply to imitate whatever there was. That's impossible. A restoration is never a complete restoration. It's a rebuilding for something that will be strong and appropriate for the current time. And in that way, you conserve. The heart of the thing is conserved and transmitted, but through restoration.
Yes.
And so this is, I think, the key to thinking about the current cultural revolution is that liberalism can't fight it, because liberalism is saying fundamentally you have to be, you just have to allow whatever people come up with. That if that's what people come up with, then you'll go with that. You need something much stronger. And what used to hold a nation like Britain, earlier England, together was this lavish matrix of inherited traditions and the responsibility of restoring them when they run down. So that's where we are now. They've run down. They need to be restored, and we have all of these resources from many centuries of thought and practice of how to conserve things, but we need to start studying them again. We need to start living according to them again.
That's actually a point that you make in the book that I found quite striking, actually, because it's something which will appear totally alien to many people, which is that you can't be a true conservative without living a conservative life, really.
Yes.
Whereas I think that the orthodox view, obviously, we don't need to tell you, is that somehow your private life is your own affair, and it's nothing to do with anyone, and that you can basically go out and be a conservative or whatever, and basically let it all hang out when you're not. And I wondered, you're quite clear about this, aren't you? In fact, you devote a section to it. The one has got to live broadly what you would call a conservative life. Now, on a day-to-day basis, would that mean to be immersed in your community? Would it be to go to the local church or synagogue or whatever it is? What would it actually entail to lead a conservative life?
Well, let's begin with what the liberal life looks like, because all of us are familiar with that. A young, talented man is 35 years old. He's living with a woman. He's lived with her for years. There's no commitment. They don't know whether they'll get married. Yeah. They don't know when children are going to come, but certainly it's later. They've moved far from the community in which they grew up, which means they don't have regular contact with their parents, and there may not even be an extended family because people have so few children. So they haven't adopted a new community. They don't have a congregation that they go to on Sabbaths. Either they go to the beach or they work straight through the what's called the weekend now. There's no Sabbath, which means there's no time to plug into a community, into a congregation. There's no time to study the ancient scriptures or try to understand things from older people who are members of a traditional congregation. None of that happens. And so, what in fact do they end up with? They end up with a career. I mean, they end up with a life that consists of attempting to move forward up in a business hierarchy. And it turns out that I mean, basically what we're seeing is that emotionally human beings can't live like this. They don't want to live like this. The sharp movement to adopt these radical certainties of woke neo-Marxism is the direct result of a life that is empty. Now, when I say empty, I don't want to make this simply a rhetorical point. I want to define it so that it's clear. When I say an empty life, I mean that at 18 years old, you cut your ties with any kind of community, parents, family, and go to a university where basically there are no adults. I mean, the adults show up occasionally to teach something, but there's no inherited transmission of a way of life. So 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds, they're all cut off from the past, and they set out on this liberal life, which is a life in which there are no obligations. There are no inherited obligations, not to country, not to family, not to church. There are no inherited obligations. And think for yourself. And here's where they end up. They end up in adrift and not knowing even that it's possible to be part of a hierarchical society, of a family, to honor your parents throughout life, to have children who honor you throughout life. All of this is lost and invisible.
There is actually. Can I just to confirm that really? There does appear as well. I've always been struck by it. That there is actually an active rejection of these things amongst many people. They don't want to be neighbourly. They automatically see the families being the bedrock of all neuroses. They want to be free of it. It's all about being free. During the Brexit debate, two groups emerged in this country, which is sort of similar to what you're saying: the somewheres and the anywheres.
Yes,
you know about this.
Sure.
It's much more parochial, but I do think it's part of what you're saying. The sort of idea of the kind of great exalted self, and all the possibilities of that, which of course for most people amounts to actually something very mundane.
Yeah.
And as you say, empty. But what would you therefore suggest they do?
Okay, well, look, here's the part that some of your viewers will not be comfortable with. I think that for a person to be healthy and happy, he or she needs to be part of the life of inheritance and transmission. That means being part of a social hierarchy in which, when you're young, you look up to the older people and you learn from them, and then you get older and then you become the teacher. This form of conservative society or traditional society, it rarely exists anymore outside of Orthodox religious communities, outside of Orthodox congregations. It could be Christian or Jewish or something else. And so at this point, if you want this kind of, I would say, much more satisfying and complete type of a life that makes human beings feel like they're doing something worthy and something important, you have to become a part of. You have to go to one of these Orthodox congregations, and instead of saying, I'm your equal, I know everything, I can judge everything that you believe, you have to humble yourself a little bit and say, look, I'm coming here because I want to learn. I want to learn what my ancestors had that I don't have. This is something that I included an autobiographical chapter in the book about me and my wife in college deciding to take up a conservative life. The reason that this is the first time I've written something like this, and the reason I included it is because I just felt that that telling people you should do this without giving an example of how it actually happened in some actual human beings' lives, that it wasn't fair.
Right.
And so I went into some depth in this story of I went to college. I met a young woman. Both of us had grown up in typically ruined liberal families. My divorce and distance from family life and distance from tradition, and we decided on the basis of the little that we knew I had an aunt and uncle who were Orthodox Jews living in Israel, and my wife had grandparents who were extremely traditional religious people. And based on the very little that we knew about it, we decided that we wanted to build that kind of a family. And in fact, we did. We joined an Orthodox Orthodox community at university, and then we now live in an Orthodox community in Jerusalem. We have 9 children and 3 grandchildren, and are part of a family that has, well, in the recent reunion of my aunt and uncle's family, there were about 96 people there, and there was a drone taking a picture of the empire that that my aunt and uncle, now in their 80s, they really built something extraordinary. And I want people to know that it's possible. It's possible to lead that kind of a constructive life, which is not reduced to the workspace in which you work for whatever corporation you work for.
By way of finishing, it's a very big question to be finishing on, but I'm assuming therefore that you think it's not possible to be a true conservative without having faith.
Yes and no. In the book, I do go into why I think that God and Scripture are necessary for Anglo-American conservatism. But I want to be careful with this, because I meet all sorts of people who say, look, I don't believe in God, and so there's no place for me in that kind of tradition. I think that's not true. I think it's important to understand that growing up in liberal society means that you've inherited a whole system of ideas, and you don't know what the alternative is. People who they think they don't believe in God, or they think that they don't believe in Scripture. What they really don't believe in is the caricature that they've inherited. And the way to get around this is, this used to be called open-mindedness, is only by participating in the actual life of a conservative community, by living with and experiencing what it is that they're handing down. Only in that way can you begin to understand what it is that they're talking about.
Yes.
So just here, a crucial example. Often a young man and a young woman want to get married, and they want to stay married. But everybody knows now that the chances that they're going to stay married are slim, because at least half, maybe even a majority in many places, are going to end up being divorced. What does that mean? It means that the skill of having a conservative marriage, the skill of having the kind of marriage that could last for 40 or 50 or 60 years throughout life, that skill has been lost. You can't just have 2 liberals join together and they'll be able to create that. You can only learn what it is by participating in a community where you have examples to see what it is. Conservatism is not something you can get out of a book. Reading about how to save your marriage is not going to help you. The only thing that will help you is time spent with older people who've achieved it, who are living it, watching them and imitating them. That's the way that you actually learn the skills of conservation. And the same thing ends up being true also about the skill of placing Scripture in your life and understanding what actually are religious people talking about when they talk about God. Those should be the things that you leave aside as you experiment with trying to live a conservative life. For most people, they eventually, if they do lead a conservative life, their understanding of all these questions changes in a constructive and interesting way, and it's helpful.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on, Yoram. Thank you so much. The book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, there we go. And it is, I think, a very important book. And obviously that's how people are seeing it at the moment. Thank you once again for coming.
Pleasure.
That's it for this week on So What You're Saying Is. We shall see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.